Well, hi, welcome. I'm Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass. As always, I am really glad that you're with me today. Now, I'm going to start by splitting the room. So watch this.
Then you'll know I'll wait for you every night. If you ever want to fall in love, if you ever want to bet on us, if you ever want to be my one, I'll be waiting. If you ever want one more night, if you ever want to make things right, if you ever want to change your mind, I'll be waiting. If you ever want to fall in love, if you ever want to bet on us, if you ever want to be my one, I'll be waiting.
So that's a flash mob. Maybe you thought it was incredibly moving. So if a flash mob broke out while you were at the mall, it would be the highlight of your day. Alternately, you may have hated every second of it. And that's me. I have a crazy low cringe threshold, and flash mobs make me so uncomfortable. If I was in a place where a flash mob broke out, I would run away or I would hide. But whether it's good or bad, we can all agree that it's powerful when a crowd of people gather together like a flash mob around a common goal. In this message series, we've been talking about our kingdoms. They're the spaces and places that we put together to make life work. And these kingdoms, they help us organize life, but they can break down. And we've talked about a lot of these kingdoms. We've talked about the kingdom of religion, of community, of the state, even the kingdom of conscience. And today we're going to continue by looking at the kingdom of the crowd. So at its best, a crowd channels people's best impulses into a controlled communal force for good. Think about crowdsourcing platforms like GoFundMe. People come together and their impulse to care for others is channeled into generosity that helps people in need. But like all human kingdoms, the crowd can be corrupted and break down. And we're going to find one of those crowds in Matthew chapter 27:15. Look at this. Now, it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner to the crowd, anyone they wanted. This year, there was a notorious prisoner, a man named Barabbas. So Jesus has been arrested by the Jewish leaders, and they brought him to the Roman governor Pilate so that Pilate could judge and execute him. But to Pilate, Jesus was innocent. And Pilate's calculating what would be his best move. He offers to pardon one of two prisoners, either Jesus or Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was not a good guy. He was notorious for a reason. Look at Luke 23:19. Luke says that Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. So Barabbas was an insurrectionist. He was a rebel against Rome who had committed murder in the struggle for Jewish independence. Now, Rome didn't tolerate rebellion. And as a result, Barabbas, he was set to be executed for his crimes. Let's continue in Matthew 27:17. As the crowds gathered before Pilate's house that morning, he asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" He knew very well that the religious leaders had arrested Jesus out of envy. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be put to death. So the governor asked again, "Which of these two do you want me to release to you?" Now, I'm sure that Pilate was probably confident in how his plan was going to play out. Barabbas, he was a known violent insurrectionist. And Jesus, he was just a weak man. He had no army, and he was only there because the religious leaders envied him. So for Pilate, surely the people will choose Jesus over Barabbas, right? Well, the people might have if the priests hadn't persuaded the crowd to release the murderer and to put the innocent man to death. And we don't really know what the priest said, but it worked. So let's pick up Luke 23:18-21. Then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Again, Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" So in his account, Luke is very clear to point out that Barabbas was an insurrectionist and murderer, as if to Luke it was obvious who should have been released. But the crowd shouted to crucify Jesus anyway. Pilate probably never thought that the people would demand that an insurrectionist be pardoned while an innocent man was convicted, but Pilate was wrong. And when he tried to argue with them, the crowd shouted him down. Look at John 19:15. Pilate says, "What, crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar," the leading priests shouted back. This verse is actually one of the most confounding things. The Jewish people, they lived under Roman rule because they had no choice. But it was a tension. Caesar, he represented everything the Jewish people were against: idolatry, paganism, oppression. At the center of how the Israelites saw themselves was the story of their freedom from slavery and oppression in Egypt. It was central to their Jewish identity and central to their hopes for the future, a future where God would lead them to freedom from foreign bondage. For them, Rome was the new Egypt and Caesar was the new Pharaoh. And for a crowd of people whose identity was based on the Exodus, to scream, "We have no king but Caesar," is shocking. Let's continue in Matthew 27:24-26. Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." And all the people yelled back, "We will take responsibility for his death, we and our children." So Pilate released Barabbas to them. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip and then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. Pilate can't get any traction. The crowd won't hear reason. They're beyond logic. They're beyond understanding. They're even beyond their own historical values. They don't care about Jesus' innocence or that Barabbas is a violent insurrectionist. They don't care about a nationalistic pledge of allegiance to Caesar. They just wanted Jesus crucified, so much that they even gladly and shamelessly take responsibility for his death. How did this happen? Why did a people with a history of slavery and oppression declare allegiance to Caesar while demanding the crucifixion of a rabbi who taught the word of God? What would make this crowd gleefully do something so counter to their history and values? Remember, at its best, the crowd channels people's best impulses into a controlled communal force for good. But when it becomes corrupted, it channels people's worst impulses. It provides cover for those impulses, and it gives people permission to indulge them. And when that happens, people will engage in acts that they may never have participated in on their own. In the 50s, there was a study called the Ash experiment, and there were a group of people who were told they were going to participate in a vision test where they were shown a picture of a target line next to 3 other lines, and then they would be asked which was closest in length to the original line. Unbeknown to the participants, everyone else in the room with them was an actor, and that actor was going to intentionally give the obviously wrong answer. And the real participant would always go last. And you know what the study found? 75% of participants gave the obviously wrong answer at least once because they were looking to the rest of the group for what the right answer was. These participants had an impulse to fit in, and the crowd channeled that impulse, driving people to answer in a way that they would never have answered on their own. So this is a harmless example, but what about the teenage girls screaming and cursing at black students on the first day of school integration in 1963 Alabama? Would they have indulged their racist impulses to scream and curse at black students if they were all alone, without the safety and the encouragement of the crowd? What about this woman who's standing on the gallows holding a noose during the January 6th insurrection? If she were there all by herself, would she have indulged her violent impulses by waving a noose around? Would this guy, would he be smashing windows at the Capitol with a baseball bat if he were all alone? Or would this guy light a pile of trash on fire in the middle of the street to celebrate his team's World Series win if no one else was there? The answer is probably not. All these things happened in a crowd that fed their worst impulses and made them feel safe to indulge those impulses by doing horrible things that they may not have ever done on their own. A crowd like the one that killed Jesus. This is important because sometimes we can think that Jesus just died for my individual sin. And that's true, but it's incomplete. Jesus' death on the cross deals with individual sin, but he wasn't crucified by an individual. He was killed by a crowd. All their worst impulses mixed together and amplified into a primal scream of evil aimed at the God of creation. The sin that infects all creation isn't just a problem to be dealt with on an individual level. Rather, it's become intertwined and mixed together into a universal corruption that is greater than the sum of its parts. One person screaming by themselves at a football game would be almost inaudible. But the collective screams of a crowd filling all the seats, it can literally shake the stadium. And the sin of all the crowd is the sin of all humanity. And it's a collective scream that crashes against God and crushes everyone in its path. Now, that's a lot of cosmic theology, but when we break it all down, there are some pieces of good news, bad news in it for us. So first, some bad news. On a universal level, we are all part of the crowd that killed Jesus. Like the mob in Jerusalem, the responsibility for his death is spread out over everyone. Evil is not just an individual problem, it's a collective one. And just like war, inequality, oppression, and injustice, it can't be solved one person at a time. The good news is that Jesus' death and resurrection wasn't just for the forgiveness of the individual. It was also for the universal defeat of all evil, to restore all creation, to silence the primal scream of the corrupted crowd and bring peace to everything everywhere. More bad news. We all have bad impulses. You do, I do, we all do. And there's a crowd of people who shares those impulses that will validate them and give us cover to act on them. I mean, we all carry a crowd like that around with us everywhere we go in the social media apps on our phones. A crowd of people who channel our worst impulses into action. But the good news, we don't have to let those impulses control us. Look at Ephesians 4:17 through 23. Live no longer as the Gentiles do, for they are hopelessly confused. Their minds are full of darkness. They wander far from the life God gives because they have closed their minds and hardened their hearts against him. They have no sense of shame. They live for lustful pleasure and eagerly practice every kind of impurity. But that isn't what you learned about Christ. Since you've heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Our worst impulses lead us away from the life God gives. They confuse us, making us think that good is bad and bad is good. But when we surrender our lives to Jesus and orient around his kingdom, his Spirit can renew our thoughts and attitudes and impulses. There's something else here that's really interesting to me, and that's how God chose to deal with the corrupted crowd. And it wasn't just to break it up. Rather, he made another crowd, one that was oriented around his kingdom. Get this. When the impulse of the crowd is oriented around Jesus, it's called the church. God created us to counter the universal evil in our world. He made us to be our best when we're in a gathering of people unified around Jesus, living out his kingdom in the world. God's answer to a crowd that would kill Jesus is a crowd that will follow him. So I have two questions as we wrap up. First, what are your impulses? What are the things that you would never do on your own, but might fall out of you if you were in a crowd of people who were like you? We saw how racism and political violence thrive in a crowd. So what are you angry about? Who do you resent and want to punish? Where do you feel under attack? What do you secretly desire? We all have horrible impulses. And just because someone else gives us permission to feel them doesn't make them right. Ask God to show you the sinful impulses in your heart and allow his Spirit to renew them. And a second question, Who is your crowd? Who are the people you feel safe saying and doing the things that you might never say or do on your own? Who are the people who say the things that you think, but that maybe you've never felt good about articulating on your own? Who gives you permission to act in ways that you wouldn't act if you were alone, but maybe you feel validated doing when you're among others? Is it the mob you carry with you on your phone and Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat? Just because the crowd makes you feel safe to act on an impulse doesn't mean it's right. The Holy Spirit allows us to recognize our worst impulses and surrender them to Him to be renewed. And God gave us the church to be the crowd that best channels our best impulses for the good of the world. So may we never be people who unintentionally find ourselves screaming for the way of Jesus to be crucified. Rather, may we be people who orient ourselves and our community around Jesus and His kingdom, so that through the crowd that He's put together, we can see His kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.